Hey everyone, welcome. All right, let's just jump right in. Today, we're digging into a huge puzzle that's right at the center of U.S. foreign policy. We're going to break down a source that asks a really tough question about how America deals with its biggest rivals. And this is the big question at the heart of it. How on earth is it possible that a pragmatic, realistic deal could be on the table with China, but the exact same kind of approach to Russia is a total non-starter? It's a contradiction that really gets you wondering, who's actually calling the shots in Washington? So here's the plan for how we're going to unpack this. First, we'll look at why U.S. foreign policy itself is being challenged. Then we'll get into a game-changing report from the Rand Corporation. After that, we'll break down the very specific reasons for a potential deal with China, see why that's not happening with Russia, and finally, we'll tackle that huge question, who's really in charge? All right, let's dive into our first section. For the first time in a long, long time, some of the core beliefs that have guided American foreign policy for decades are facing a serious challenge, and it's coming from the inside. So the source we're diving into, it argues that for years, U.S. foreign policy has been running on this kind of hubris ever since the Cold War ended. The thinking was pretty simple, right? America won, period. And because of that, no other power, whether it's military, financial, you name it, should ever be allowed to challenge that #1 spot. So what's shaking all this up? Well, it's a report from a very influential group, a report that the article we're looking at calls a small revolution. First off, you might be asking, who or what is the Rand Corporation? Well, this isn't just any old think tank. We're talking about an institution whose reports have, for decades, carried huge weight. They've literally shaped American foreign and defense policy. So when Rand puts something out, yeah, the people in power definitely listen. And a big takeaway from this report, it's a game changer. It basically says the US and China should aim for a modus vivendi. That's a fancy Latin term that just means finding a way to coexist peacefully. And that means accepting that the other side has a right to exist politically, instead of seeing them as an enemy you have to defeat. I mean, this is a total 180 from the old way of thinking, which was all about absolute victory. So, if this kind of revolutionary idea is catching on, why China specifically? Why now? Well, the source breaks down some very practical, almost cold-blooded reasons why a deal is suddenly on the table. It really boils down to three main things. First, there's the military reality. A growing number of experts are saying the US just can't win a long war with China. Second, our tech sector is critically, and I mean critically, dependent on China for essential materials. And third, there's a serious legal storm brewing that could totally blow up the administration's tariff strategy. Let's put some numbers to that tech dependency. Think about rare earth elements, the stuff you need for everything from your smartphone to fighter jets. China controls 70% of the world's mining for it. 70%. But wait, it gets crazier. Mining is one thing, but refining it into a usable form, China controls 94% of that. That's not just leverage, it's practically a stranglehold on the entire supply chain for modern tech. And then you've got the legal bombshell. The president's tariffs are being challenged in court, and those cases are making their way to the Supreme Court. Now, if the court rules against the administration, they could be forced to pay back all the money collected from those tariffs. So as the source puts it, a negotiated deal with China starts to look like a rescue mission to avoid a massive financial disaster. Okay, so the case for a practical deal with China seems pretty solid, right? But that brings us right back to that bizarre paradox we started with. Why isn't the same logic being applied to Russia? Well, the source says it's because of some incredibly powerful groups at home who basically have veto power. According to the article, there are three main roadblocks. We're talking about pro-Israel megadonors, certain factions on Wall Street, and the whole NATO establishment, that entire network of military and political interests that are all tied up in the Atlantic Alliance. These are the groups that are apparently stopping any kind of normalization with Moscow. So you gotta ask, what's the motivation? The article argues that for the pro-Israeli donor bloc, the #1 goal is to preserve U.S. military dominance, no matter what. This is seen as absolutely essential to ensuring Israel's security in a very tough neighborhood. And it's not just them. The source also points to a group on Wall Street with a totally different concern. The argument goes like this. The U.S. financial system is way over-leveraged, and to keep it from collapsing, it needs to be propped up by hard assets. Think oil, natural gas, real stuff you can touch. And that financial logic, well, it heavily influences U.S. policy towards any country that's rich in those resources. And all of this, it leads us to our final and, honestly, most important section. Let's pull all these threads together and really unpack that central question from our source material. You just can't get around the contrast here. It's so stark. On one side, you have the China policy, which is being driven by cold, hard realities, military, tech, legal stuff. But then you flip over to the Russia policy, and it seems to be playing by a completely different rulebook, one written by powerful domestic interests with their own very specific goals. So it all comes down to this. This is the ultimate question the article leaves us with. Who actually controls U.S. foreign policy? I mean, really? The answer the source suggests is, well, it's pretty stunning. It suggests that on some really important files, the president doesn't have much power at all. That instead, he gets these very clear, very blunt reminders from powerful players. Reminders that say things like, no normalization with Moscow, period. And this whole complicated mess is playing out with a political clock ticking in the background. You've got the midterm elections coming up, which could totally stall the president's plans. You've got major trade deals like the new NAFTA, the USMCA, that are facing their own deadlines. All this stuff just adds another layer of pressure and complexity to every decision. And while all this is happening at the top, there are these big shifts happening underneath. The article points out that support for Israel is actually dropping among younger Americans. Now, down the road, that could create a real clash between the established policy being pushed by donors and what the voters, even within the president's own base, actually want. So at the end of the day, what does all this add up to? This quote from the source really nails it. The old world order, that globally connected system we all got used to, is being swept away. And what's replacing it is a new world of standalone economic blocks. And that leaves us with this final, really stark thought. The forces that are reshaping our world right now, they're not temporary. So whatever happens in these internal DC policy fights, the source is clear on one thing: that old, comfortable world, it's just not coming back.